Welcome back to Blam Blam Truckers. We are doing the Cybertronian Misadventure. We're in Chapter 9, Shoot the Moon. Secundus was beaten, battered, and bruised. Defending the shuttle from a dozen Decepticon seekers had nearly taken him offline. It had taken Grinder offline. Doc was with Grinder in the infirmary right now, trying to get him back online. Secundus was back in the captain's chair on the bridge. Forager was flying the shuttle. Grunt was at the fire control station. A fire control station on a barely functional hyperspace shuttle with no weapons. That pretty much summed up the whole mission so far. Secundus had taken too many hits from the Seeker's lasers. It hurt to move. So he didn't move. It hurt to think. As leader of this tiny band of Autobots, he had to think. Luckily, there wasn't much to think about. Forager was piloting them out of the atmosphere so they could jump to hyperspace and leave their dying homeworld behind. Their cargo was the most precious thing in the known galaxy. They had thousands of spark chambers and processors of offline Cybertronians. On a living world with fresh energy and available materials, they could build the sparks new bodies and start bringing their people back to life. That was a dream worth taking a few laser blasts for. Primus, how his body hurt. Doc had already looked him over, and Secundus would heal in time. The silence on the bridge was something of a comfort to Secundus. Something beeped. Secundus looked over towards the sound. Pain. Turning his head hurt. The sound came from the co-pilot station. It was sitting empty. Grinder had been stationed there before the Seekers had attacked. Keeping one hand on the yoke, Forager leaned over to the co-pilot station and flipped a switch, shutting off the alarm. "We've just cleared the atmosphere, sir," the former geologist said as he leaned back into the seat, putting his other hand back on the yoke. "Jump the ship," Secundus said with a groan. Forager's optics were glued to the readouts on his station. "I can't go into hyperspace. I don't have the coordinates. We cannibalized the astronavigation computer for parts." He paused. "It was broken anyway." That's right. They needed an astronaut to calculate hyperspace travel paths. Or they could work out the calculations by hand, but that was hard math, and Secundus could barely do those calculations when he wasn't hurting. Besides, only Doc knew where they were going. Some solar system on the other side of the galaxy. Something about being in the middle of nowhere, in between the spiral arms, out past the farthest reaches of the former Cybertronian Empire. Some explorer had reported about it once, millennia ago, before the war. Doc was telling him about it weeks ago after they found the shuttle. Secundus didn't respond for so long that Forager peeled himself away from his screen to glance back at his commanding officer. The lieutenant was just sitting in the ship's captain chair. Forager quickly looked back at his console, double-checking all the gauges on the radar, especially the radar. They barely survived the last Decepticon attack. Forager was scared there would be another. "Secundus?" Forager asked tentatively. "Do you want me to call Doc to the bridge?" Doc! Doc could do the hyperspace calculations. They just needed to get him. Doc was in the infirmary with Grinder. Secundus was pretty sure he already knew that. Somehow, despite it not having any moving parts, even using his internal AM radio hurt. Still, Secundus managed to call Doc to the bridge. They sat in silence while they waited for the tiny medic to get to the bridge. Forager was checking and double-checking all his screens. Without Grinder as a co-pilot, flying the ship fell solely on his shoulders, and that was more responsibility than the triple changer normally held. Grunt sat at the fire control station, just as diligently doing his business. Grunt was a strong bot. He had an aptitude for moving things, and did surprisingly well in combat of late, but flying a shuttle was not his element. On the other hand, he had been the first one to spot the Decepticons coming up on radar. And he had taken far more laser blasts than Secundus had, and hadn't so much as scratched his finish. If he wasn't in so much pain, then Secundus may have begun to realize there was more to Grunt than met the eye. For his part, Secundus sat in the captain's chair, the only seat in the shuttle built for a bot of his size, and tried to will the pain away by sheer force of will. It wasn't working. "Lieutenant?" Grunt asked, breaking the silence. There was a long pause before Secundus turned to look at Grunt. Longer still before he answered. Yes, Grunt. Grunt didn't seem to notice the length of the pause or the hurt in Secundus's voice. He happily answered his commanding officer. I think there's a distress beacon on the further moon. That's impossible, Forager said without looking away from his station. The moons were evacuated after the Decepticons razed them during the war. I was part of the evacuation teams before I got assigned to this unit. Grunt shrugged. He was used to being wrong. Okay. Sorry, Lieutenant. There was silence again as Secundus processed what the two bots were saying. It took him a minute to realize Grunt may have found another discrepancy. With a groan, Secundus said, Put it on the big screen, Grunt. Sir, Forager protested, it can't be real. Cyclonus Magnus ran those raids himself. There were barely any survivors, but we got them all. Besides, this was nearly a millennium ago. Do you really think there could still be anyone functioning? Grunt paid no heed to Forager's protest. He had an order, so he carried it out. It took him the entire length of Forager's little speech for him to figure out how to send his screen up to the main view screen on the bridge. There was a single button that was reserved for exactly that purpose. It was very prominent and explicitly labeled. Grunt had missed it the first dozen times he was looking for it. He pushed it just as Forager stopped talking, the main view screen filling up with the distress beacon signal and a rough location on Luna 2. Forager spared a glance up from his console. It's a trap. What's a trap? Doc asked as he walked onto the bridge. Forager sighed. Grunt thinks he found a distress beacon on one of the moons, but it can't be a distress beacon because we evacuated the moons 1,000 years ago. It's probably a Decepticon trap. Doc nodded as he walked to his station. It was a general console. No specific jobs were tasked to it, but it was made for a Class 1, which still made it a little too big for the diminutive Scholar Pod. Doc had to kneel on the chair to reach the console. He didn't use the keyboard. Doc transformed his hand to directly interface with the ship. Interesting, Doc said in his normal, measured bedside manner. This beacon was activated less than a century ago. It's broadcasting a standard Autobot distress call. We should check it out. It's a waste of energon, Forager spat the words out, and we don't have any energon to spare. You sound like Grinder, Doc replied. Forager glared at him, but Doc was nonplussed. It wouldn't take that much energon to fly over there. We can scan the area from orbit and gather more information. Meanwhile, we all use our solar ports to make more energon and donate extra energon to the Energon Cube Bank. There hasn't been any Decepticon activity since the attack, has there? Forager pouted. He didn't like where this was headed, but he did his job. No, there's no sign of Decepticon activity or any other activity since we cleared Atmo. Secundus was torn. After that last attack, he wanted out of the Cybertronian solar system as soon as possible, but they were a search and rescue crew. He couldn't leave Autobots in distress. Especially now. There was so little energon left in the solar system. No one was manufacturing it. The Decepticons had control over Cybertron itself and were attacking everyone else. He couldn't leave an Autobot behind, but if it was a trap, then his entire mission could be over. It was a tough decision, and it hurt to think. Secundus finally spoke. If we can save a few more Autobots, then we have to take the chance. We'll do Doc's plan. Doc, I want you to start calculating the hyperspace jump. If it's a trap, we'll be ready to jump, Doc said in his calm, reassuring way. It took 3 days to travel to Luna 2. Before the war, they would have made a superluminal jump, but that would use up more energon than it was worth. Using their engines used less energon. Forager aimed the shuttle at Luna 2 and fired a sustained thrust. Then he turned the ship 180 degrees and fired a sustained thrust to slow them down. 3 days to make 2 major maneuvers. Space travel and atmospheric travel were very different. The trip allowed the Autobots to utilize their solar ports to recharge themselves. Secundus and Grinder used their energon to heal. The other Autobots donated their excess energon to Doc's supply of energon cubes. They didn't make up enough fuel to bring any of the energon cubes to full, but they ended with more fuel than they started with. A net gain was good. When they got to Luna 2, Grinder was able to co-pilot, and Secundus was more functional than before. Neither one was near 100%, but they were healing. Once in orbit, Grinder took the pilot's console. Forager transformed to his plane mode and entered the moon's atmosphere. Because of atmospheric reentry, this is something he would never try in Cybertron's atmosphere. Luna 2's atmosphere was considerably thinner. No organic life could survive there unprotected, but Cybertronian life was fine. Even with the thinner atmosphere, it took a few hours to get to the distress beacon, his radar running the entire time, paranoid about it being a Decepticon trap. Sensor scans. Forager ran every scan he could think of. He ran them 3 times. If it was a Decepticon trap, then Secundus' standing orders were to jump the ship. Forager would be left on his own on Luna 2 with a bunch of Decepticons. The thought terrified him. So he ran the scans a 4th time, to be sure. Forager to shuttle. He was transmitting directly overhead via his internal AM radio. Shuttle here, Grinder's voice came back. Go ahead, Forager. Forager sighed over the radio and replied, I've located the distress beacon and I'm ready to transmit scan data. Awaiting orders. Yeah, Grinder said, his usual disdain coming through the radio waves. Give me a minute. Transmission cut off and Forager flew in circles above the beacon, keeping an eye out for Decepticons. It was minutes before the radio crackled back to life. All right, I think I got the computer ready to receive. Send when you're ready. Forager sighed and sent the scan data. He continued flying in circles. The light from Cybertron's sun was hitting his wings, his solar port filling up his energon reserves. It was a glorious day on Luna 2, and normally Forager would be relishing in the chance to fly free. But he was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was a Decepticon trap, so he couldn't enjoy this flight. He was too on edge. I think we got it, Grinder said over the radio. Take a break while the big brains figure out our next step. Forager gave his acknowledgement. He tried to choose between landing and staying flying. If he landed, then he could review the scans easily. If he stayed flying, he would be in a better position to escape a trap. Normally, Forager would land and keep his radar up, confident he would be warned of any threat with enough time to respond. No. He was certain this was a trap. He would stay in the sky, bored out of his mind but alert and prepared for the Decepticons. Bored was right. It was nearly an hour of flying in circles before the radio came to life again. Forager was doing fancy maneuvers like corkscrews and barrel rolls to keep himself awake. Forager. It was Secundus. Go ahead, Forager replied. We've gone over the scans. There's no sign of Decepticons at all. Looks like a tunnel system. We need you to find a way in and check it out. For the first time that day, Forager felt unsteady on the wind. Sir, I'm not comfortable going in there without backup. There was a long pause. After a beat, Forager said, Did you copy, sir? I'm not comfortable. I heard you, Secundus said, more gruff in his voice than normal. Give me a moment. We're trying to work out the logistics. Yes, sir. Forager kept flying. The Decepticons were hiding in those tunnels, he was sure of it. Finally, the radio crackled back to life. Head back to the ship. You're going to have to fly down your backup with you. Forager smiled to himself as he pitched his nose up and accelerated. It was the first thing to go right all day. Grunt was soaring through the skies. He wasn't using his jetpack. Grunt was fastened into a magnetic harness they scavenged from the shuttle's airlock. The harness was attached to Forager's winch line. Still, flying through the light atmosphere of Luna 2 was exhilarating. I'm not too heavy for you, am I? Grunt asked over the AM radio. Forager responded, Luna 2 has less gravity than Cybertron. Okay. Grunt paused. So, I'm not too heavy? If he was in bot form, Forager would have been shaking his head. He knew better than to give Grunt answers that were even a little less than direct. No, Grunt, you're not too heavy. Good, Grunt said. He relaxed into the harness and enjoyed the feel of the sun and the wind on his quadritanium skin. Over the last few days, while they were flying through space to Luna 2, Grunt hadn't been much use. Everyone else had something to do. Most of them had too much to do. When they weren't on the bridge, they were all doing maintenance on the shuttle. Grunt couldn't do maintenance. He couldn't pilot. He didn't really understand what hyperspace calculations were, let alone how to do them. All Grunt could do was donate the excess energon his solar ports were producing. Doc assured Grunt that the energon he was contributing was important. Grunt didn't think so, but Doc was usually right. This was something he could help with. He wasn't great with maps or not getting lost in tunnels, but Forager was along to handle that. Grunt was here to punch Decepticons. He was real good at punching Decepticons, and tunnel fighting was guaranteed to be close quarters combat. Grunt was looking forward to this. Forager let Grunt on the ground, light as a feather. He really was an amazing pilot. Grunt released the winch line from the harness, and Forager retracted it as he transformed into bot mode and landed next to Grunt. At 18 feet tall, Grunt was short for a Class 2, but he was a massive 18 feet tall, all mechanical muscle. Forager was more than a few feet taller, but lanky. The two bots were every bit an odd couple. Forager grinned at Grunt and gave him a friendly slap on the arm. "Come on, buddy," Forager said with a grin. "Let's go spring this trap." Grunt blinked. How many decades had they been working together? Centuries? This was the first time Forager had called him buddy. Odd, but nice. Grunt smiled and followed after Forager. Buddy. That was nice. Maybe one day they would become brothers. Forager led Grunt to the distress beacon. It was just a pile of rubble. Much like Cybertron, her moons were decimated by the war. The two bots stared at the rubble pile for a moment. Grunt broke the silence. "Where are the tunnels?" Grunt looked at him askance and blinked at Grunt a few times. Was he serious? They're underground.
"Yeah, but where?"
Grunt asked. Forager pointed at the pile of rubble. Grunt looked at the pile, then back at Forager. "You're kidding me." Forager shook his head. Grunt sighed. "You're not kidding me. Now I know why you wanted me along instead of Grinder." Forager managed to stifle a laugh. Grunt was rarely this insightful. "Grinder still has a hole in his head, in case you forgot. Plus, Grinder and I are the only pilots on the crew. Do you want to fly the shuttle?" Grunt was already clearing the rubble. To the Strongbot's credit, he had already cleared a surprising amount.
I could do it. I did real good with my jetpack the other day."
Grunt shook his head. Forager shook his head. Forager shook his head. Grunt had almost died from running off the shuttle in mid-flight. True, he had crushed the final Decepticon, attacking them in the process, but he was still falling to his death before he remembered he even had the jetpack. Forager had to save him. It was only fair. Grunt had just saved the rest of the crew. Forager was starting to wade into the rubble to help when Grunt said, "Got it." The Strongbot bent down and grabbed the door's handle. He pulled on it, but the door stayed shut.
"I think it's stuck,"
Grunt said without letting go of the door handle.
"1 second."
Grunt gave it another yank. The heavy door ripped off its hinges and went flying into the sky. Forager watched it sail into the clouds. With Luna 2's light gravity, he wouldn't be surprised if the door ended up in orbit. Forager couldn't do that. Secundus, a Class 3 bot, couldn't do that. How strong was Grunt?
"Let's go,"
Grunt said, oblivious to the incredible display of strength he had just performed as he started walking down the ladder into the tunnels below. "Grunt, wait!" Forager shouted. Grunt stopped, his optics barely showing over the edge of the entrance.
"What?"
Forager shook his head. "It's probably a trap, remember? Let me scan first so we don't set off any snares." Grunt sighed. This was not going to be fun unless he found some Decepticons to punch. He climbed up the ladder and let Forager go first. It was dark in the tunnels. Both bots turned their exterior lights on. They spoke sparingly, mostly Forager saying stop or wait every 50 feet or so. They would stop and he would run a few scans. Grunt tried running scans the first few times, but he was quite bad at it. Forager wasn't just better at it, he had specialized tools to improve his scans. Even with all his fancy skills, Forager wasn't finding any traps. They were down 2 levels before Forager's sensors found anything of interest. They were outside of a closed door when he gave the hand signal to stop, and Grunt got excited. Finally! Decepticons! Grunt stretched a bit and cracked his knuckles. He was ready for a fight. "I'm picking up a faint trace of energon," Forager whispered, using the AM radio, even on an encrypted channel. Sorry, let me try that whole paragraph again. "I'm picking up a faint trace of energon," Forager whispered. Using the AM radio, even on an encrypted channel, would notify the Decepticons that there were other Cybertronians around. The sound of a whisper was unlikely to travel very far.
"Want me to go first?"
Grunt asked. It was called taking point. He should have asked if Forager wanted him to take point. Should he say that now or just let it go? Forager nodded and turned to the side, giving Grunt plenty of room to pass him. Strongbot drew his ion pistol and brought it to a low ready. He grabbed the door handle and glanced over to Forager. The tall scout had his weapons readied and was looking anxious. Grunt grinned at him, then turned the handle, shoved the door open, charged into the room. Oh, Oh, the wrong time to yawn. I apologize. I'm going to start that line over. I'll go back to the tall scout had his weapons readied and was looking anxious. Grunt grinned at him, then turned the handle, shoved the door open, charged into the room, turned left, cleared to the corner, and turned, sweeping the room. It was a textbook dynamic room entry. Forager should have been behind him, turning right when Grunt turned left, clearing to the other corner, then sweeping the room. Only Forager wasn't in the other corner, and there wasn't anyone moving in the room. The room was filled with bots, but they were all lying down. Is it clear? Forager asked, the barrel of his weapon poking around the corner of the doorway.
Clear,
Grunt said in his deep rumble of a voice.
I'm not sure what's going on in here.
Forager stepped into the room. Weird. Are they Decepticons? Ion pistol at the ready, Grunt walked over to the nearest bot. Looking down at him, Grunt shook his head.
I don't think so. This guy is a red Autobot symbol.
Forager sighed. Let me run a scan. While the triple changer was scanning, Grunt looked around the room. He noticed some writing on the wall. That was odd. Most Cybertronians use digital devices to communicate. They had a written language, but it was so much easier to share digital files rather than write something by hand. He got closer and inspected the writing. It was a short message, laser etched onto the wall. Weird.
Hey, Forager, come check this out,
Grunt said. I'm still scanning, Forager replied. Just tell me what you found. Grunt shrugged. Forager probably knew better than he did anyway.
They wrote a message on the wall. It says they came to the moon searching for Energon, but Seekers followed them. They fought off the Seekers, but their ship was destroyed. With no way back, they deactivated themselves and set up a distress beacon.
Grunt blinked. That couldn't be right.
They wrote a date here, but it must be wrong. It's centuries old.
That matches up with what I'm getting from my scan. I've got 12 bots in stasis lock, some of them damaged, and an intermittent distress beacon that's nearly out of power. Forager shook his head. What do you think, Grunt?
I'm confused. I don't know what kind of trap this is.
Forager looked at the strong bot. You think this is a trap? There was a tremble in his voice. Grunt nodded.
It's gotta be.
Why? Forager asked. Grunt stared at him for a long moment.
You said it was a trap.
Does this look like a trap to you? Forager asked.
No,
Grunt said.
but no two traps look alike.
Forager let out a short laugh. Trust Grunt to be 100% right about the wrong thing. Look, Grunt, there's not enough energon in this room to hurt either one of us.
So, Grunt paused. You're saying now's a good time to spring the trap.
Forager shook his head. No, I'm saying it's not a trap. It's just a dozen offline Autobots. Getting them to the shuttle was going to be a logistical nightmare.
Oh,
Grunt took a moment to look around the room. He blinked a few times.
we should help them.
Forager couldn't help but smile. Being stuck together for the last century or so hadn't been easy. Grunt's simplicity was infuriating. But there were times like this when Grunt's sympathy put all the rest of the galaxy to shame. Yeah, I guess you're right. It wasn't that complicated getting the offline bots to the shuttle, just time-consuming. Forager had to fly the offline bots to the shuttle one at a time. It was 2 hours to the shuttle and 2 hours back. Grunt had all the offline Autobots out of the tunnels and ready for transport before Forager was back from delivering the first one to the shuttle. They should have stopped to get some sleep, but no one wanted to leave themselves out in the open. There had been no sign of Decepticon activity now that they were off Cybertron, but no one wanted to take that chance. Grunt was the last bot Forager carried to the shuttle. They were both exhausted, but Doc made them donate energon before he let them go off duty to get some rest. When they woke up, they were in hyperspace, on their way to a planet, all the way across the galaxy. Alright, truckers, that is the last chapter I've written for the Cybertronian Misadventure. Like I said, I started writing this as a lead-in to kind of get my players, my normal RP group, interested in actually doing a Transformers RPG. It didn't work. It kind of started to work, but it didn't end up working, which is fine. But that was like the first 3 chapters. Once I got the story in my head, I couldn't stop writing the first story there. There's one more story I have written about meeting Grunt meeting a human on Earth. Um, yeah, I could read that one to you guys as well if you're interested. But the idea here was initially when I was writing this, I wanted my players to take over these characters. I made these characters based off the other characters that they had played. I changed them up a little bit, but the more I wrote them, the less they were just a little bit of a personality paragraph and some vague descriptions of their abilities. You'll notice I don't go into any detail on the weapons of anyone except for Grunt and Grinder. Um, I don't go into their loadouts so that my players wouldn't be locked in to exactly what their abilities were. Um, yeah, so I was very vague, and if they changed it or changed it completely, they changed it a little or changed it completely, it would be fine. What ended up happening is these characters are mine now. I've put a lot of effort into them, so I don't want my players playing them anymore because uh, I just don't. So now this is kind of like they're mine. They're my so now I put a lot of work into these guys. They've come to life. Hopefully you feel the same way reading this, that they've come to life to you too. So the reason I wrote this chapter, this was not planned. This event was not planned when I first started writing. They were just going to leave the planet and get to Earth. Um, what I what I ended up doing for this chapter was they brought a dozen, roughly a dozen more Autobots onto the ship that are depowered. So um, it wouldn't be that hard for them to use some of their energon to start bringing those Autobots back online. And yeah, uh, they don't have a lot of energon left. They'd have to, so it would only be, at most 4 of them. It wouldn't be all 12 of them. This also would lead into a story factor of gathering enough energon to bring the other Autobots that are deactivated back online, that are in stasis mode back online, then build bodies for the. So I'm giving my characters goals here, my players' goals. So they'd want to gather enough energon once they get to Earth to bring uh, the deactivated Autobots from Luna 2 back online. They'd want to build bodies for the deactivated Autobots, just the sparks and processors they brought with them, and Doc would be working on a way to actually reproduce Cybertronian life without a Vector Sigma, or try to build a Vector Sigma computer, so he could start creating new Cybertronian transformers. And yeah, there's a whole storyline there where he'd go into how would Cybertronians reproduce without a Vector Sigma, and that could be a plot line for Doc and for the rest of them while they're on Earth. So yeah, that is the story. It's pretty much done at this point for a lead into the RPG. I wanted to leave the RPG open-ended. I have ideas of what I would do for my players. This could also end up becoming like a TV show if I ever get a chance to pitch for a Transformers TV show. This is a great start to a brand new take on Transformers that would introduce new characters to the franchise that I think are quite lovable. I certainly have fallen in love with them. And yeah, I it's really what Transformers needs, is something new. Um, Optimus is a fun character, but we've all heard his story 10 times. It's time to do something new and different with the franchise. So if anybody from Hasbro is interested, feel free to contact us through YouTube, and I will happily. You've probably heard the pitch at this point of what this series could be, but there's more to it, and how I would actually tell the story with new Transformers, and yeah, or I could just change it all and turn them into giant transforming robots who aren't from Cybertron, and I'd have to come up with all new names for Energon and Cybertron and all that stuff. And I already have a new take on how the war started and what was going on there. So I guess I could create my own series here if somebody who wasn't Hasbro wanted to do a giant transforming alien robots story, which there's precedent for. There's the Transmorphers, there's GoBots. The concept is not. That's actually why Hasbro in their RPG that they put out a couple of years ago, they've started using the term not only in the RPG, but it's most obvious in the RPG, but in their TV shows as well. They've started to use the term convert instead of transform because they want to protect the copyright on their name Transformers, so they can't let transform be the general term. It's all legal mumbo jumbo. But these characters I've created are all original creations, and if I may have they may have started being inspired by Transformers and GoBots and Transmorphers, but they are my own creation, and it wouldn't take much for me to turn them into its own unique world. Um, just some naming, and that's not my best. It's not the thing I'm best at, but come up with a new name for a planet, come up with and give them 3 moons instead of 2 moons around the planet, so they can't say, you're just ripping off. So you're copying Cybertron. This is plagiarism. No, remember, plagiarism is when you borrow from one source. Homage is when you borrow from many sources. So I could even make it like the world that they lived on was a moon that surrounded a gas giant. That would be interesting. Anyway, enough of that. Thank you for listening this far. Sorry for the rambling at the end. If anybody knows somebody at Hasbro who wants to hear a pitch, have them contact me. Or at another, TV movie company who wants to hear a pitch, it's the same pitch. And yeah, him comment down in the comments down below, or send us a message through YouTube, or contact us on Facebook. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and keep on trucking, you blam blam truckers.